Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Melbourne. My name is Michael Breer. I'm the Director of the Melbourne Energy Institute, and I welcome you here on behalf of both the Grattan Institute and MEI. Before we formally commence proceedings, of course, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this in-person only event is being held. It'll be recorded and circulated via email and everything socials later on, but it's in person only. And as a result, I need to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is being held, the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. An in-person only event, how's that? Who'd have thought? It might catch on. Thanks everybody for coming along tonight. Great to have such a healthy attendance. Tonight we're talking about electrifying households and how to do so in a fair and cost-effective way. And in order to do that, we've got some wonderful speakers from Grattan, from the university, and also from the Brotherhood. And in order to introduce our guests properly and the events this evening, I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Pierluigi Mancarella, who's a Professor of Electrical Engineering at the University of Melbourne and runs our efforts on what we broadly call energy systems in MEI. So thanks everybody, and Pierluigi, if you will.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. I say that this is a really exciting topic. I did actually my PhD on integrated energy systems, and my first job as a postdoc at Imperial College in London in effectively 15 years ago, 2008, was to work on sustainable and affordable decarbonization of heating. Now, after 15 years, nothing has happened in the UK. So I really hope that Australia will do a little bit better. I think we have the right speakers here, definitely, for the job. So the first will be Miss Alison Reeve. She is Climate Change Energy Deputy Program Director at Grattan Institute. She has 2 decades of experience in climate change, clean energy policy and technology in the private, public, academic and not-for-profit sectors. Alison was previously General Manager of Project Delivery at the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University. She led development of Australian National Hydrogen Strategy in 2019, as well as other Commonwealth energy and climate initiatives. So maybe we can just say. Thank you. Thanks, Alison. Then let me introduce the second speaker, would be Sangeetha Chandrashekeran. She's a Senior Research Fellow in the ARC Centre of Excellence on Children and Families over the Lifecourse and the Indigenous Knowledge Institute here at the University of Melbourne. Sangeetha is an economic geographer with a focus on the political economic dimensions of environmental change. Her research focuses on the role of the state and the equity and distributive aspects of energy transition is underway. She has published on the evolution of demand management, marketization and social equity and environmental outcomes, and metering rollouts and consumer citizen benefits. Thank you. Thanks for being here, Sangeetha. And last but not least, there will be Damian Sullivan. He is currently Acting Director in the Social Policy and Research Centre at the Brotherhood of St. Laurence and leads the climate change energy team there. Damian has substantial experience in policy, research, and innovative pilots across energy affordability, energy efficiency, and climate change, with a focus on social impacts. He's passionate about working with communities facing disadvantage to seize the opportunities for a transition to low-carbon economy. So thank you also, Damian. So as I said, perfect speakers for the job. And let's go to the first one. Alison, please. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about 3 things tonight. Why getting off gas at home is a good idea, why it's not easy for many households, and what governments should do about that. Right. So why is it a good idea for us to get off gas at home? Well, let's start with the story about what happens to the gas that we use. About 22% of Australia's emissions come from the production and the use of gas. So that's the red bars that you see on this chart. And it is not possible to meet our net zero targets without eliminating these emissions. In Victoria's case, it's not going to be possible to meet the interim climate change targets either without making a very large dent in gas use. Now, as you can see on this chart, residential emissions might be quite small compared to industry, but there are 5 million homes using gas. The logistics of making the change to reduce these emissions is quite formidable. For homes, electricity is the cleaner option. It used to be, and I'm sure a lot of you are holding this in your head right now, it used to be that gas was the most environmentally friendly thing that you could do in your house. Now, that is no longer the case because of the efforts that successive governments have made to encourage the growth of renewable electricity. In Victoria at the moment, in 2023, it is still the case that if you switch your appliances from gas to electricity, there will be a slight increase in emissions, and that's because there's a lot of brown coal in the mix in the electricity system in Victoria. And you can see that the chart on the left, right? The orange bars there are the all-electric homes, the red bars are the dual-fuel homes, so the ones that have gas. But over the next decade, that's going to flip, and it will be cleaner to use electricity in every state in the country, including in Victoria. And that's what we've shown there in the chart on the right. So it is increasingly going to be the case that if you want to do the right thing for the environment, the way to do that is by switching your home over to using electricity. Now, electricity is not the only way to get rid of emissions from gas and homes. Some companies have been pushing hydrogen as a substitute for gas because it burns without any emissions. What you can see on this chart is the projected price of hydrogen in the yellow and the projected price of gas. And what you can see there is hydrogen is very expensive, and it is not going to be cost competitive with the gas that you're using now until after 2050. So while hydrogen might technically be a way to do it, the economics of it do not stack up for individual households. It is also not an easy option. You have to switch over the burners on your stove because hydrogen burns differently. And you have to do that switch at every house in the street at the same time. And if you've tried to get your neighbours to agree on anything lately, you know that that's probably not an easy task either. The other thing is that electricity is going to be cheaper than hydrogen to do the same job because it's more efficient. So what we've got in this chart here is the cost of using hydrogen to heat water, that's the yellow line, and the cost of using electricity to heat the same amount in the orange line. And again, the cost of those is not going to converge until nearly 2050 because electricity is just so much more efficient than burning something to do a job at home. And then here's the real kicker. If you switch from using gas to electricity at home today, you will probably save money. And this chart shows you what you would save over a decade in each state if you're an average house by choosing electric appliances for your hot water and your cooking, which are the dots on the left. And on the right-hand side, if you add heating to that, how much your savings will be. And in colder states like Victoria and the ACT, the savings are quite substantial. In Melbourne, you're looking at somewhere between $12,000 and nearly $14,000 over a decade, and that is definitely money worth having. Now, that's all the happy news about why getting off with gas is a good idea, but it's actually not very easy for a lot of people to do. The majority of Australian households will face one or more barrier to move if they want to move from having gas appliances to electric ones. About 30% of all homes are rentals. That's the dark red bar on this chart. And for those homes, the appliances that they have are their landlord's choice, not theirs. Depending on what state you're in, once you get into the owner-occupied buildings, between 3 and 8% of those households are in apartments, in multi-unit buildings. And those buildings often don't have separate gas connections. So you might not want to use gas in your apartment, but if you want to switch over to electricity, you may not actually have the choice to do that. So it's not really easy for people who live in those buildings either. There's another group of owner-occupiers who are the orange bars on this chart, who have low incomes or low savings. And these are people who, however much they might want to switch over and however attractive those savings might look, they simply do not have the money in the bank to do it. And that's actually quite a substantial chunk of owner-occupied houses. And then the remainder, which are that yellow group there, They may not face a really explicit barrier, but there might be lots of other reasons why they can't change. There might be space constraints, time constraints, preferences, etc., etc. The other thing is that even though you save money over time by moving from gas to electricity, efficient electric appliances cost more than the gas equivalents. There is one exception here, by the way. If you have a ducted gas heating system and you move to using reverse cycle split systems, you will actually save money on the capital cost of that heating system as well as on the running cost. So maybe you want to think about that if you've got ducted gas at home. But this cost gap is important across all of those groups on the previous slide, right? Landlords are not going to choose the more expensive appliances, particularly when it's the tenant who's saving the money. If you live in a multi-unit building, you're going to have a tough time convincing your body corporate to choose more expensive options for things. If you're low income or don't have a lot of ready cash, then there's no way you're going for a more expensive option. And if you're not in one of those groups, it is always difficult across anything to convince people to pay more upfront for something that saves them money in the long term. The other reason why this transition is a difficult one is because people tend to stick with what they know. What we've got on this chart here is the percentage of broken water heaters by type and what replaced them. It's from a survey that was done of consumers in Victoria. And what you can see is that people do a like-for-like replacement when things break. Nearly 90% of people who had a gas water heater that broke replaced it with a gas water heater. Now, some of this comes down to urgency, right? If you had woken up this morning and there'd been no hot water when you turned the shower on, you would have grabbed that fridge magnet that you've got that says 24-hour water heater replacements on it, and the first question that the plumber would have asked you is, what sort of water heater have you got now? And you would have told them and they would have said, yeah, mate, I can have one of them round by the end of the day. And you would have said, brilliant, let's do that. And the other, so, you know, this you have this really, really strong impact of the fact, you know, that people want to do these things in a hurry because they're an essential service. And so they are much, much more likely to just go with what they know rather than think through changing to something different and thinking through the economics of that and the space constraints and everything else. The other thing is that most households haven't thought about this, which is fine. You know, we're all busy. We've all got lots to do. We don't all sit around thinking about our energy bills all the time. And even though this sort of varies a little bit depending on, you know, where people live and what their financial situation is and what their life stage is and so on, pretty much half of people have not given any thought to switching from gas to electricity. And if we want to, over time, move all of those households off gas, we actually have a really large task to get all of those people to start thinking about this and then to be convinced to change. And finally, the other reason why this thing is a hard problem is because the gas network is expanding. More homes are joining the gas network every year than are leaving it. So there is actually quite a strong trend of individuals going towards gas rather than away from it, even though that's not necessarily in their best economic interests. So is there a role for governments here? Well, Grattan Institute says yes, there is. We think it's in consumers' economic interest to make this switch. It's not possible to hit net zero targets and still have widespread use of gas. So the question then is, what should governments do? The first thing they can do is provide some certainty to people. And the best way to do that is to set an end date for using gas in homes. The ACT government has done this already, and so and other states really should do that, including especially Victoria, because Victoria is one of the states that uses the most gas in homes. They also need to stop making the problem bigger by banning new connections. And the ACT and the Victorian government have both done this. In other states, local governments are starting to step up to this in the absence of state government action. The third thing that governments need to do to provide certainty is to rule out hydrogen for widespread residential use. It is unlikely to ever be in consumers' best economic interests. There is a role for hydrogen in decarbonising the economy, but it's going to be in the industrial sector. And continuing to keep the option open on hydrogen for the residential sector is actually wasting time and it's wasting money. The other thing is that we really need to start this now because, like I said before, there are 5 million homes that are connected to gas networks across Australia. Getting each of those ones onto a zero emissions alternative by 2045 if you're in Victoria or 2050 if you're in the other states is a really, really formidable task. In Victoria, you would need 200 homes every day to electrify to meet the 2045 net zero target. And that number is larger if Victoria wants to meet its interim target, which is quite ambitious. Now, there is some good news here, though. In Victoria every day, about 400 homes have woken up and found that their water heater is not working or their heating system is not working or that the stove is not working and they are replacing an appliance anyway. And that is faster, that is more appliances than we need to get to in order to get to the net zero date. So if we get there on the replacement cycle alone, we can maximise the savings for people and we can actually make this relatively painless because we are catching people at the point where they're having to make a decision anyway. But that window won't be open forever and we actually need to start that process now. Now, I showed you the chart that showed that it was more expensive to choose the electric option over the gas one, and we think governments need to step in and help to close this cost gap. The best way to do that would be to risk share with financial institutions so that there is a financial product available to anyone who wants to upgrade. Now, that's a very economist-y kind of way of saying something. So what I mean is, if your water heater is broken, you should be able to finance that the same way that you could get finance when you got a new TV. You should be able to get a sort of, 6 months interest-free, no repayments for 3 years type finance package. Or you should be able to ring up your bank and say, can I draw down on my mortgage to do this? You should be able to get a green upgrade loan for your house if that's the sort of thing that would suit you better. So the thing is, though, I sort of added there too, we think for landlords, the best way to close that finance gap would be to give them a tax break if they choose a electric appliance rather than a gas one. But the thing is that ultimately we want taking out your gas to be the normal thing to do. And we can't have government subsidising this all the way to net zero because that would get quite expensive. So what they should do is do enough to build up the market, but then use regulation to enforce the norm. So this could include using appliance regulation to phase out the sale of gas appliances over time so they would just become harder to get and electric ones would be easier to get. It could include minimum rental standards so that landlords have to put electric appliances into homes. It could use the building code to make new homes so that they're all electric. The thing is we can't do all of those things right now because the supply chains are not there to deliver on it. So that's why we're saying do incentives first and then do those ahead of regulation. We should also think, and I think Damian and Sangeetha are probably going to talk more about public housing and community housing, but government is the landlord in public housing, so really they should be doing the right thing by their tenants and making sure that they're getting the most cost-effective option. This is going to be a really long-term project, so governments need to be investing in good and tailored and targeted information campaigns over multiple years. They need to build the norm, but it also means they need to communicate with people so that people can make this change when they're ready. You do not want to leave this task until 2045 if you're trying to meet a 2050 deadline and then suddenly start telling people that they should be changing. And finally, governments really need to start thinking about how they regulate gas networks. So up until now, I've been talking about what electrification means for individuals, but there's also a collective problem here as well. Gas networks cost pretty much the same to run if you have 10 users or you have 10,000 users. And if large numbers of people start moving off gas networks, it is those who are left behind who have to pay the whole cost of running the network. Network costs are already more than half of the average gas bill. The people who are left behind are going to be those who are least able to afford to pay for gas. They might be renters, they might be people who are on low incomes, or they're going to be people who don't have the option to switch, either because they don't have the money, they live in an apartment, or they're renting their house. That's also not mentioning, by the way, the number of businesses who use the distribution network and aren't actually paying for the bulk of the cost of it at the moment. The regulatory framework that we've got at the moment is premised on an expanding network where using more gas is in consumers' best interests. And this is not a situation that's compatible with having a net zero target, and it's something that we need to change. We also need to recognise that gas consumers are also electricity consumers, and we need to think about how we shrink the networks efficiently and we share the costs of that fairly. I'm going to stop there, but really looking forward to hearing your questions after we hear from Damian and Sangeetha.
Today I'm going to talk about a report that we did with the Brotherhood of St. Laurence and through the Centre of Excellence that I'm in, which is the ARC Centre of Excellence for Children and Families over the Lifecourse. This research was funded by Energy Consumers Australia with additional financial support from Melbourne Energy Institute, and I want to acknowledge all the co-authors on the screen there. Before I go any further, I too would like to acknowledge that this research was conducted on the lands of the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging leaders. Now, there has been some good research done on the gas transition at the household scale, but it tends to be surveys that are representative of the general population. And for example, Infrastructure Victoria surveyed 1,000 households using gas. We found that there was very little research that specifically looked at the attitudes to the gas transition by those facing the greatest barriers, low-income households. So the research that, and this graph just confirms much of what Alison's already told us about the cost savings that can be found from switching away from gas towards electricity. This research sought to understand better what lower-income households in Victoria thought about a transition away from gas and the barriers that they face in electrifying their homes. And the research looked at the adequacy of existing supports to electrify and what supports would help accelerate electrification. This research couldn't have been done without the partnership with the Brotherhood of St. Laurence due to their trusted role in the community and their ability to recruit and then provide follow-up support where needed. So we recruited households who had received energy-related support from the Brotherhood and were on a lower income. Now, the low-income households, as defined by the ABS, are those in the lowest income quintile, and at the time, this equated to an equivalised disposable income of less than $583 per week, or about $30,000 per year. However, we didn't apply a very strict inclusion criteria in line with this definition, and that's because the research shows that other household characteristics contribute to energy vulnerability, such as disability, caring responsibilities, or health problems. In the survey that we did, almost 9 out of 10 of our households of respondents had an equivalised income of less than $40,000 per year, and 9 out of 10 relied on income support. Now, the survey asked households about their energy use, their preferences, financial stress and energy hardship, their willingness to change to gas appliances, their support for the policy-driven transition away from gas, and importantly, the motivations and barriers to switching and their need for assistance. So I'll be reporting today on statistically significant intergroup differences. We followed the survey up with focus group discussions to delve deeper into the challenges that they face and the lived experience. And we did these focus groups in metropolitan Melbourne and also online. So our households samples skewed to older respondents. There was a reasonable mix of tenure. Close to half of the respondents lived in their own home, with 30% owning their home outright and 17% paying a mortgage. Half were renters, and that includes both private and social housing. About 1/3 of the sample were living with children, and of that group, about half were single parents. More than 1/4 had caring as their main activity, and 1/4 spoke a language other than English. We asked a series of questions about financial stress that was modelled on the nationally representative Hilda sample, and based on that, over half identified as being in financial stress. The average financial stress score was 2.6, which was markedly higher than the average Hilda score. Around 1 in 3 of our survey respondents were unable to heat their home due to a shortage of money in the past year, and this was significantly more likely amongst young people and renters. 2 out of 5 couldn't heat their home or had gone without meals due to a shortage of money. Now, compared to the Infrastructure Victoria sample, our households were more aware of limiting energy use. In the focus groups, there were distressing accounts of energy hardship. People were living in thermally uncomfortable, energy inefficient housing, and they were putting up with this because the rent was relatively affordable. They were freezing in winter, they were overheating in summer. They were also depriving themselves of heating, using the dog for thermal mass, and they talked about feeling the cold more as they got older. Women were going without heating once the kids had left home and enduring that discomfort because they couldn't afford gas heating. Apologies for some of the figures not overlapping with the text. Importantly, despite all of this, there was very strong support for a transition away from gas. Over 2/3 supported the transition and half strongly supported it. There was a reasonably strong preference for gas over electricity, particularly for cooking, and that was mainly because of the perceived speed, flexibility of cooking with gas, although few of our participants really had experience with induction stoves. Preferences for gas or electric appliances were strongly linked to existing usage, and this suggests that the experience of using electricity for heating, including reverse cycle air conditioners, may lower the attachment to gas heating. The positive perception for gas was less marked in our group than in the general population, if we use the Infrastructure Victoria survey results as a comparison. I think addressing performance and reliability concerns around gas appliances will be really important to convincing people to switch. There was considerable uncertainty about the relative benefits of electric versus gas appliances. You can see the large numbers in the dark blue, I don't know. Only 28% of survey respondents thought that electricity had lower running costs than gas. 72% thought gas was cheaper or the same or didn't know. Almost half didn't know which was cheaper to buy and install. So as Alison said, communication is key here. There's a lot of work to be done convincing people that electricity performs as well as gas for heating and cooking, and there's the need for robust evidence and good communication on this point. Around 1 in 10 of our surveyed households had replaced gas appliances with electric ones within the previous 5 years. This suggests that support for the transition in principle hasn't been translated widely into action. And the 2 most common reasons for switching were lower running costs and environmental benefits. For those who hadn't replaced their appliances, tenure, so being renters, and the cost of replacing appliances were the major barriers. 1 in 5 of our households had solar, and solar households were more likely to switch away from gas. Twice as many households with solar as without solar had actually replaced their gas appliances with electric ones in the previous 5 years. So having solar is significantly linked to an ambition to replace gas appliances into the future as well. Now, knowledge about support programs differed depending on whether the support was for energy bills or subsidies to electrify. Government support programs specifically designed to address affordability had a high degree of awareness. So the power saving bonus and energy concessions. In contrast, there was much lower awareness and a big gap between awareness and uptake of government programs which support electrification. Around 1 in 3 people in our survey had heard of the Home Heating and Cooling Upgrades program and the Victorian Energy Upgrades program. There was higher awareness of the Solar Homes program, particularly amongst men, those over 60 and those living in their own home and not experiencing energy hardship. For the Solar Homes program, awareness by homeowners was twice as high and uptake 3 times as high compared to renters. Information about how to electrify was more highly sought after by people who spoke a language other than English at home. In focus groups, renters who had a direct and positive relationship with their rental provider were more likely to see the potential in the Victorian Government Solar Homes program than those who did not know their rental provider or didn't have a good relationship with them. Despite some very positive views about the scheme, most renters told us that they were deterred by the challenge of coordinating with multiple entities and the upfront cost that they would have to pay. Environmental motivations were a strong driver for switching away from gas, but achieving this was heavily constrained by financial resources, and you can see this in the top 2 quotes. Trust emerged as a very significant barrier in focus groups. There was a heightened perception of risk due to a lack of a safety net should things go wrong. If I make a mistake, I don't have the resources, being on a pension, to wear that. There was a sense of a lack of agency and disempowerment that we heard about from social housing residents, because they don't actually control the decisions about the nature and the timing of upgrades. So in the report, we have a number of detailed customer journeys that show the enablers and the barriers for electrification for some of the focus group participants. I should say this is in the longer version of the report. So you can see here the enabling factors are in green and the barriers are in red. So here's Diego, whose name's been changed. He is an environmentally motivated forever renter. He's on good terms with his rental provider, but he has a lot of affordability concerns. He's on a pension. And his customer journey towards electrification really should have begun when the gas heater broke down. But he and his rental provider didn't have the awareness of the benefits and the supports to electrify. So he lacked agency to make a decision. The heater took a long time to be replaced. And then for 2 months they were waiting, and then one day it was just installed without consultation. So he's the type of renter who's interested in electrifying, but the sequencing of events, the information provision, and the lack of requirements or standards led to gas lock-in. We also have Zor here, and Zor's story tells us about the importance of cultural diversity and the need for culturally informed strategies. So he co-owns a home in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne with his wife and toddler and another couple with a child of a similar age. They were all refugees to Australia. And the men are employed in low-pay but full-time factory work, while the women share care for the kids and do some part-time study and work. So they installed solar largely because recommendations came from within the Burmese community and the installer was Burmese. So Zor made this long-term investment in solar but hadn't connected this to a plan for appliance replacement. So they're still on gas for cooking, heating and hot water. And one of the main reasons they said was because they feel overwhelmed by information in the second language and they don't trust mainstream sources of information. They're really looking for local community information. So from the focus groups, we surmise that there are different levels of interest and capacity to electrify amongst lower income households, and these barriers are not uniform. In the top right-hand corner, those most willing and able to switch tend to be environmentally concerned homeowners who have time to focus on their home. In the top left-hand quadrant, there are those who are willing but not able to electrify, and they tend to be environmentally motivated, like Diego, but struggle with energy affordability and have a low level of awareness of the supports and very constrained by upfront costs and security of tenure and trust. And, in the bottom right-hand corner on the left, there are those who are not willing nor able to electrify, and they face the most severe hardship. Just getting by day to day dominates everyday decision-making. They're much more likely to be renters, including those in social housing. So to conclude, and Damian will pick this up in terms of policy recommendations, our findings for the research are that despite widespread support for the transition, there are significant barriers, most notably rental status and inability to finance upgrades. Simple information provision is important, but it's insufficient. Information needs to be tailored to diverse household needs and delivered at the right time, like when an appliance breaks down. It must also be delivered by trusted sources. Our respondents had a lot to say about a lack of trust across the supply chain. I'll let Damian continue now on the policy recommendations coming out of this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Sangeetha, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past and present. The BSL's involvement in this work comes from hearing a lot from people we work with about the energy affordability challenges they face and the potential for savings from going all electric that Alison has spoken about. Also, the need to reduce emissions and for Australia to contribute to global emissions reduction efforts and the importance of residential gas as part of that. And a concern that low-income households and renters as well will be left behind in the way that Alison mentioned. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, particularly with the team from the Grattan Institute with such a timely and comprehensive report on the challenges around, on the opportunity and challenges around electrification. As Sangeetha mentioned, we identified a number of implications for policy from this report. They very much draw upon the insights from the participants in the research. The first was around multiple stresses, and many of the households we face were facing multiple stresses in terms of precarious housing, issues around affordability of housing, or insufficient income. For example, there was a woman with her 6-year-old daughter who was facing moving house very soon in a very tight rental market outside Geelong, and she didn't know where she was going. And for her, the last thing on her mind would have been how efficient that new house would be. It was more about finding a house that was affordable to live in. We know that these sort of challenges need to be addressed for themselves, but also they are barriers to the transition as well. Information and knowledge came through really strongly in the challenges people face. As Sangeetha said, support for electrification was very high, but there was relatively low awareness of support services and very little action by many of the households. We really saw an opportunity around co-designed and better targeted information and advice, particularly for those who speak a language other than English. Another area that came through very strongly was the perceived risks in the shift to electrification, which was magnified for those people, renters and those with limited savings. As Sangeetha mentioned about Maria, who said, if I make a mistake, I don't have the resources being on a pension to wear that. And that includes things like heat pumps. Many people don't know about heat pumps for hot water. Will it work for them? Or fear of possible future rent increases as a result of upgrades or the implementation of standards. We saw that addressing the structural barriers to the split incentives as key here and providing tailored advice and information. And the tailored advice and information came through as a very strong theme. One of the participants, actually, I think it was Diego, who Sangeetha mentioned, proposed something that's been talked about a lot in our circles, which is a one-stop shop where you could go to for trusted independent advice, but also where people could get tailored advice specific to their needs as well. People were much more likely to trust local government or community service organisations, but they weren't very trusting of tradespeople, retailers, including Bunnings, which we were a bit surprised by, or energy retailers. So the importance of more evidence-based information on the benefits of electric appliances versus gas, particularly the lifetime savings, is really important, as is ensuring co-design, particularly with culturally and linguistically diverse and people on low incomes. Investing more in accredited training, such as been done by the Plumbing Industry Climate Action Centre around heat pumps, is really important as well. So plumbers can provide the right advice, but also training up more electricians, as is identified in the Grattan report. Building energy literacy also has a role for some households. Another thing that came through very strongly was the need for a plan for the future of the residential gas network to build trust and reduce uncertainty for households. Households are concerned that if they make a decision now and purchase appliances and then we don't get rid of gas, will it have been a wasted purchase? We also want to avoid lock-in where people purchase gas appliances and have to replace them down the track. To this end, we very much saw a need for state and federal governments to have integrated plans around electrification and endpoints for residential gas, as Alison mentioned. Further iterations of the roadmap in Victoria will be useful in this regard. Government regulation should also ensure further investment in the residential gas network does not lock in future vulnerability. And here we're particularly concerned about the costs of decommissioning new areas. So we really welcome the moves in Victoria to ban new future gas connections in new households. Tenure and control also came through very strongly, and a specific strategy for renters is really important in this regard. We would see standards for rental properties, energy efficiency standards, which include electrification as part of them, as important. These have begun in Victoria, but there's very little in other states, and we need to move towards it urgently, as well as information and targeted incentives for landlords. Investment to transform public and community housing to be 100% electric and energy efficiency is also essential. The other one that came through very strongly was the need for addressing the capital barriers. Many households, even asset-rich low-income pensioners, face capital barriers to these type of upgrades. And we'd say appropriately targeted grants and rebates are needed for these groups to stimulate action. And low and no interest loans have a role to play. And we particularly like Solar Victoria's no interest loan that they have, which is easy to apply for, relatively simple to pay back. But they have their limits in terms of the group that we work with. One example of the importance of capital barriers was one of the participants in the focus groups who, because of cost pressures, she was looking around for what to do with new heating, and she didn't have the upfront capital when her heater broke. And what she ended up doing is buying plug-in heaters, which will cost her much more over time to run. So it's that mix of capital barriers plus lack of adequate information as well. Rooftop solar and access to rooftop solar is also very important, and enabling more renters to have access to rooftop solar is essential. As is, I think, connecting energy efficiency with electrification. So when more households shift onto the electricity network, the demand on that network is not as great. Finally, the need for inclusive planning processes. And we would see a strong role for government here, and this shouldn't just be left to industry and the gas networks, for example, to be doing the community engagement around the future of the gas network. To wrap up, we see huge opportunity here in the electrification agenda for the households we work with. There's potential to lower bills as well as reduce emissions and make homes healthier. But to do so, it needs to be a managed transition. And we really need to ensure low-income households and renters aren't the last ones on the gas network and left behind. Thank you. Oops.
Work? Okay, great. Thank you. That was really good. So I think we can just open floor. Like if there is any question, please. Okay, this lady here.
Have we got roaming mics? Yay, here comes B.
Sorry, whoever's Hi, Linda Bradburn from Darebin Climate Action Now. I'm very interested in energy efficiency in that it's called the fifth fuel. And what do you think state and local government should be doing about improving energy efficiency, which appears to be so bad, particularly in rental stock?
We could probably just talk about that for the next 3/4 of an hour. Do you reckon, guys? I think, to go to the rental stock question, I think the best way to solve that is with a minimum rental standard. So just saying that you can't rent out a house unless it has some basic things in it. The ACT government has done this around ceiling insulation. There was just a regulation that came in this year that you can't rent out a property in the ACT unless it has ceiling insulation that meets a certain R value. It's a pretty low R value, but it's better than what a lot of the houses have already. But that's sort of only 30% of houses, right? Then you've got the rest of them. The building code does some, but that's really slow. I don't know. It's such a hard one. Like all of that energy efficiency gain has been hanging around there since the 1970s, and we have never managed to crack getting it happening on a mass scale. And I'm just, other than regulatory approaches, I really struggle with how you might get the rest of it.
I think we would agree rental standards, along with some targeted incentives, whether that's probably more at a state government level, and also the potential for federal government activity there as well. At a local government level, I'm less sure of the opportunities.
The only thing I'd add there is that I think local government has a really important role to play in the provision of good, trusted energy advice. And Darebin and other local governments have really led on this. And we heard from the households in the focus group that local government is regarded highly in terms of trusted information, and it was also very close. So I think that issue about energy efficiency advice being scaled at the right level and being tailored appropriately, it's important to think about which are the agencies and institutions that can deliver this best. And I think local government is one of a number that's best placed to do that. I think the capacity of local governments to do that is very varied, and that's a resourcing issue that really needs to be addressed.
One other thing that governments could do is implement the commitment that they made in 2004 to make it mandatory to disclose the energy performance of a house when you sell it or lease it out. That commitment was literally made 19 years ago. The only jurisdiction that has implemented it is the ACT. And I actually looked this up the other day, right? During that time period, 8.9 million properties have changed hands. So we have missed 8.9 million opportunities to give people information that would save them money at the point where they're about to make the biggest financial decision of their lives. There is evidence from the ACT, who has implemented this, that all the other things being equal, you get about a 1.5% increase in the value of a home if it has a higher star rating than a low star rating. So we know that it does influence people's decisions very slightly, but it doesn't have a massive impact on housing affordability. So really, the rest of the state governments could get onto this, and actually, I think that would to some extent help with energy efficiency.
Okay, thank you. I would just move on because it's not really about energy efficiency. So I'm sure there are lots of other interesting questions. That was very relevant. It was actually also my question, so thank you. So any other question? Yeah, please, the gentleman here.
Yeah, hi, energy investments. We've heard a lot about incentives to consumers, notwithstanding the obstacles. We've also heard incentives for policymakers in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases. What we didn't hear about, that's my question, are there any incentives for policymakers, be it federal or state, from either gas or electricity? I don't know, tax collection, royalties, donations to political parties. I mean, are there other incentives we didn't get presented to policymakers, not to consumers?
It's a good question. I mean, the state governments get the royalties from gas, but those would be, because most of the gas that Australia produces goes overseas, that would be the dominant side of that. I don't think, other than in WA has got state-owned gas businesses like retail, I think, and networks. Tony, I'm looking at you. But the rest of the country, they're all private businesses, so there's no money flowing to governments from those. And there's state-owned electricity networks in some states and not others, where, there might be extra revenue some way for governments if you switch more stuff to electricity. But it's actually a really good question. I'm actually not sure.
And I'm not sure either, but just to point out, we are often frustrated that many of the gas networks have the same owners as the electricity networks. So ideally we would go to the electricity networks and get them on side and get their support. But that causes quite some, I guess, that interaction there doesn't allow you to leverage that potential benefit.
Thank you. That was really a difficult exam question. Well done. Please.
Yeah, hi. Why? So one of the problems, obviously, is the size of the regulated asset base for the gas networks. Why don't we just allow them to be written down? And particularly, these companies became owners of these regulated networks, and there's risks and benefits to that. And part of it is the risk that this technology becomes stranded. These networks become stranded. Why don't we why doesn't the regulator just write down the value of the networks, and so you don't have this death spiral that consumers potentially face?
Yes, but also equity. So while you are writing down the network, you still need it to be there and be operating and be safe. And if you have not made the effort to move people off gas who can't move themselves, so your renters, your low income people, your people with low capacity, your people who don't speak English at home, or whatever that thing is, they are left there paying whatever you need during the write down. And it's possible that during that period the network gets to such a state that it's not operating reliably anymore. So they're the people. So what you're doing, the people who end up bearing the most risk in this are the most vulnerable gas consumers and the gas company. And so to make it, I guess you kind of have to ask the question of whether that's fair. But it costs the money to meet the standard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the who should bear the cost, who should pay question. And the only other thing I'd add is that this is the problem that you have when you have private spatial monopolies in this kind of light-handed economic regulatory system. And maybe one option is to think about who should own the network into the future as well, and how those costs then get borne by the state and distributed accordingly in a fairer way.
There's not a clean answer to this. Like this is something that many minds are really grappling with and shrugging their shoulders and going, God, I just don't know. Like, how do we do this? It's hard. It's really hard.
But I guess the important point you're making is that at the time of the purchase of these assets, there was foresight. It was a known risk. So there are implications.
And one thing we were concerned by in the last access arrangements in Victoria was the accelerated depreciation and how that shifts the costs onto consumers, in terms of there's some positives in that process, but consumers end up paying more.
Yeah, I mean, from the gas network's perspective, in some states, they were actually, we had rules in Victoria and the ACT that if you developed a new area, you had to put gas connections in. Like, they were kind of told to expand. But at the same time, they were allowed to make returns that were above the risk-free rate. So it's hard to decide even what's fair on them as well.
My question might be somewhat related. Alison, you showed a slide before that showed a flat line through to 2050 for the cost of gas compared to hydrogen. This just relates to the cost of gas, and you mentioned that half the price of a gas bill is the network. Is the extrapolation of the people that are left behind in terms of their bill being mapped? Can you say if you're left behind and you're carrying that cost of the network, what does that line look like then? Because it's obviously not a flat line anymore.
Sure. So that flat line was just for the gas, not for the network.
Yeah.
So underneath that, you've got something else that's lifting it up. And the thing is, if you're keeping the same asset base and it's costing you the same amount to run, and you've got fewer people on it and you're paying a per person charge, then each person is paying more. So gas bills for those who are left would be going up.
So is that, I mean, has someone modelled that to say in 15 years, someone that's low income is going to be paying $4,000 every 3 months for their gas? I guess that's my question is when is the tipping point of irresponsibility that someone will say, well, we have to do this? Because you said, let's wait till 2049. You didn't say that, but you said maybe that's an option. Obviously, it wouldn't be an option if you have 30 or 40% of people having a gas bill that's higher than their rent bill.
I'm not aware that anyone has modelled that. Are you guys?
I heard recently about somebody that's done it, and it was in the order, it wasn't as great as I had thought it was. It was in the order of $1,000 in about 10 years' time. But for the people that we work with, that's a lot of money additional on their gas bill. Perhaps for some others, not quite so much, but certainly for those we work with.
Just a question on financial incentives. I know that there's a big focus on government offering those incentives, but I think, Alison, you mentioned the risk sharing model with financial institutions. The funding from the CEFC, do you think that's sufficient enough to cover this transition? Does it need to be more targeted? And is there a bigger role for financial institutions in this transition?
So just to explain what that is for people who don't know, there was a package in the budget this year of about $300 million, which is extra capital, which is given to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is kind of the government's green bank in a way. And the idea was that money was going to be used for energy, what they called energy upgrades for the residential sector. So this comes to your energy efficiency question, but it could also come to home electrification. That money would be way more effective and could do way more homes if instead of it being loaned directly to consumers, it was loaned to banks to take the risk out of them developing a green loan of some sort, because the only amount you would need to cover is not the full amount of the loan, it's just the extra risk premium on the loan. So we think that's, you could get way smarter use out of that money. I don't know what the right amount is, because it kind of depends on how efficient and how good you want to make all these homes and how quickly you want to do it and whether the supply chains are there and so on. But there are certainly ways you could use that money in a way that's smarter.
And certainly for those that we work with, the more lower income or those facing some form of energy-related stress, there's a real reticence around loans that have interest rates of, beyond zero, or even zero interest loans. There's often a reticence around it. So we would think it's a great thing to have in the market, some products, but it's probably not going to work for the people we work with particularly.
What is the earliest and latest date each of you thinks is likely to be the switch-off date for gas in Melbourne?
In Melbourne? I'm not from Melbourne, so I'm going to hand to the people who are. So I live in the ACT and we have a switch-off date, which is 2045. So it's already been settled. And yeah.
Well, maybe we should just copy that. I mean, just speaking even at the household scale, it really has a lot to do with what your plans for the house are. So, for example, we're working through a whole range of options to whether to renovate or knock down our home. If we were to knock down our home, we would get off gas immediately, even if we renovated it. But that's got a lot to do with, financial capability and planning. So I think, to Damian's point, that a clear end date really makes that decision cascades down to the lowest level and makes it much, much clearer for households to actually do that planning at the micro level and accelerates all of us getting off gas. But there do need to be the right supports to enable that.
And if I took your question right, you're asking what are the earliest and latest that...
What I was thinking is if the transition accelerates quick enough, it'll have to happen more.
And maybe I'm a pessimist. I mean, I feel like the politics of this are probably quite difficult and that we'll see quite a scare campaign around gas, and we're already seeing that with the gas industry talking about renewable gas and the advertising on renewable gas. So if I was to guess, I'd be going the absolute earliest 2035, the latest 2050 or beyond.
Just to reinforce the need for reliable information, I noticed that Tristan Eads, in his column in the AFR recently, excuse me, made the point that there's a sort of an unusual feature in the transition from gas to electricity in terms of heat pumps, and that is you've got a whole lot of brands people have never heard of. So I think that would add to the barriers that people are a bit risk averse about buying a product that they know nothing about, and there's a risk that it won't be around for long, and they've got a bit of a white elephant.
Is there a question or just so let's stick to questions, please, and otherwise everyone will have a comment. So please, let's go on with questions.
Great, thank you. Emma O'Neill, Good Shepherd, thank you for 2 excellent reports. I was just wondering if you think there's a role in Victoria, a role for a VDO for gas. I guess the risk we face is that gas retailers, they see the writing on the wall and seek to maximise their profits during the period ahead through inflated retail prices. Do you think there's a role for that?
So a VDO is the Victorian default offer, which is like a
plain vanilla electricity contract
set by the Essential Services Commission. We would think that there's a role for it. We've heard it's quite hard to do. If anyone's tried to compare gas offers, we had a team of people working on helping low-income households compare gas offers using Victorian Energy Compare. It's incredibly difficult using the government's tool, and it's not terribly reliable, we found. So a gas default offer, if it can be done to give people a fairer price, would be fantastic, I would think. And just to mention on the heat pump issue, one of the things about heat pumps under the Victorian Energy Upgrades program, the state-based white certificate scheme, and similarly a program in New South Wales, there are quite some cheap heat pumps available to people as incentives come through. And I guess we and others have a concern that those cheap heat pump hot water systems that come into the market, people might get one through one of these energy efficiency programs. And if that fails, they're then like, oh, heat pumps are rubbish. So the issue of brand trust in new heat pumps and other systems is a real one, and the quality of services provided as well.
One of the things we recommended in our report was that heaters and hot water heaters and cooktops need to be brought into the appliance regulation framework. You know, when you buy a fridge or a washing machine, it's got a star label on it. That star label doesn't just represent how well it performs. It also means that it meets certain minimum performance standards, and that doesn't exist at the moment for water heaters and for cooktops or for heating systems. So bringing appliances into that framework would be the first step towards actually basically getting the crap out of the market.
I think you just answered most of my question, but it was around whether or not any research has been done into the relative durability of electric appliances versus gas appliances, because that has in terms of the replacement timeframes, has a big impact if you try to model that out.
I don't know. I know that the tax office assumes they have the same lifespan. So, but I have no idea how good their research is.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, Alison, you touched on hydrogen as, or why it's probably not the savior of the gas network. But the other straw man we see propped up is biomethane or renewable gas as the savior of the network. How would you respond to?
Sure. Yeah. But biomethane is gas that is chemically the same as natural gas, but it's made, instead of coming from a fossil source, it's coming from a natural source. You know, it might be sewage, it might be food waste, it might be agricultural waste or whatever. The best estimate that we could find of Australia's capacity to produce biogas was that it would be able to produce about 1/3 of current Australian demand for gas. So that means we need to find a substitute for the other 2/3. Now, there are some people who use gas at the moment for industrial purposes who are really where electricity is not a substitute, right? Either because they need the gas not for its energy content, but for the carbon and hydrogen that it contains to do a chemical process. So making fertilizer is an example. And there are also industrial users who use gas because they want really high temperature heat, and electricity is not so good at doing that. So when we think about gas in the broad rather than just for households, you can see that there's going to be some people who need gas, and those are going to be the people for whom hydrogen and biogas will be the solutions. But there isn't enough biogas to cover everything that we use gas for at the moment. So it's kind of going to be the people who really, really need it. We should be developing up biogas supply chains and industries in order to supply them, rather than just assuming that we're going to be able to use it in every house in the country.
Thanks. Roger Dargaville from Monash. Fantastic research, and this is really great stuff and very timely. I was surprised not to hear so much about indoor air quality. I've heard, I'm no expert in this space, that especially for gas space heating, that you seriously degrade indoor air quality because of that. Would it potentially be more of a motivator for people to get off gas onto electric if they knew that it was causing health problems?
We did actually ask a question about which they thought, what qualities were better for gas appliances versus electric appliances, what benefits, and health benefits was one of them. And it actually came up with a fairly low response rate compared to the others, such as environmental benefits or even safety in the home. So that I thought that was interesting, because I thought that issue might play more significantly as a motivator for people to switch. But it did come up in focus groups, didn't it?
When we did our report, we did look at the health benefits of switching. The research was not as clear cut as I would have liked, actually. It does seem that some of the indoor air quality stuff, particularly around cooking, is around ventilation. So it doesn't disappear when you switch to cooking with electricity. So, if you think it through, if your kitchen's poorly ventilated and you're frying something, it's going to smell like frying, and you're going to have, all sorts of things floating around in the air, regardless of whether you cooked on a gas stove or an electric stove. And so some of that seems like some of those health effects are not 100% clear cut yet. Even though there have also been some studies that say, well, for people who have asthma, for example, switching to an all-electric home has helped them.
Other questions? Please.
What's being done overseas in this area? Is there any, can we benefit from other countries' experience?
A lot of countries are grappling with this because a lot of countries also have net zero targets, and in Europe they're also desperately trying to get off gas because they don't want to buy it from Russia. On the policy side, a lot of places do, here's your rebate, here's your loan, that sort of thing. did not come across any examples of people who'd had a really cracking way to get renters off and low-income households. It seems like that is hard wherever you are. I think some parts of the UK went a long way down the path to looking at hydrogen rather than electrification, but seem to be walking that back now. Some places in Europe have just been quite clear cut and just said the gas network will be going in this city from this date. Get yourself organised and get on with it. It can be a lot easier particularly in Europe, because often the gas networks are owned by the local council, so you can do it in quite a small contained area. The cost of who pays is all very clear and that sort of thing. It's been very fraught in the US. The US is having a full-blown culture war over gas stoves, which I sincerely hope does not get imported to Australia. And some states in the US have actually passed laws that say that you can't ban gas stoves. So, yeah.
And am I correct, Alison, in your report that in Europe there's a separation for networks between gas and hydrogen that they can't?
Yeah, so in Europe you do have some networks that are separate hydrogen networks that are there for industrial users of hydrogen. And there's also been an EU directive that has said that member countries in the EU have to start a process of figuring out how they are going to, basically coming back to the gentleman's question before, how they're going to write down their gas networks and under what circumstances they can repurpose those networks for hydrogen. So they have said you can't just pretend hydrogen is going to be there forever and ever. They've said you have to be very clear about under which circumstances and who pays for that. But then they've left it up to the individual countries to figure out how to do that.
And one particular thing that we've quite liked and others have picked up as well is the one-stop shop that's happening in Ireland. So you would go to a provider and they would manage the whole upgrade for you. They would go and see what you need in your home. They would give you grants and rebates, and they would actually project manage the whole upgrade process for you with access to various government funding as well, which we think is one of the opportunities to explore here as well.
The only other thing I'd add is that in the European Union, the framing around the equity dimensions of this is much stronger. There's a much stronger commitment to addressing energy poverty. There's a whole framing around no one being left behind in the transition. And there's also an EU initiative around a widespread renovation, retrofit of homes, although I think the implementation at the member state level is patchy. But I think we lack that kind of framing. I think we also lack a robust discussion around the nature and scale of energy poverty in this country. And therefore, some of these issues are kind of quite opaque to us. And I think also the framing around no one being left behind could be much better integrated into our policy frameworks.
Okay, so I need to... Michael, do you want to say something? Okay, just very, very quick last question to Michael. Wait.
Sorry, just one question. Udara, I work for AGL, but also passionate electrification. Is funding through or financing through local councils or through their, council rates? Because this is common in Europe, but in Australia it's not so common. Why is that? And is there a possibility to actually expand that?
Well, certainly Darabin has a scheme, a solar saver schemes, where people can get solar systems and pay them back through their over 10 years with no interest, which we think is a very good scheme, but it does cost quite a bit to run, as I understand it. But it's a great scheme, particularly if you're on a low income.
I was just going to say, in New South Wales, the big barrier to that is that there's a rates cap. So they've just basically decided that rates can't ever be higher than a certain number, which means really limits council's capacity to do anything innovative like that. They could take that off, of course. But.
So I think it's been really wonderful. I will abuse of my position to ask the very last question, but you need to be very, very fast in the answer. So without gas, is it the end of wok cooking or not?
No, it's not. I have a really good story, but I will let Sangeetha go.
We did a focus group with Burmese households, and we thought we would hear the strongest resistance from them because they're very committed to wok cooking, and they were very willing to make the change with the right enablers. So I think it can still continue without gas.
Good. Oh, okay, that's great. So thank you. It's been wonderful to see all of you in person. Please join me in thanking the panelists. I'm sure you were great work. Fantastic. I mean, especially because I had to say that some questions were really, really difficult. So they're very, very well done. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you very much. Thanks.